Eishi tachiyo, America he ga samateiru. Juki no sochakushi, totsugeki no junbi o seo. Deno heka banzai! Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast. I'm your host, Devon, and before I go any further, a good friend of mine mentioned my podcast in his latest episode, so I will mention his podcast here. His name is Doan, and he runs the Entertainment Fanatics podcast. You can check it out on Instagram at Entertainment Fanatics Pod. In this episode, we will be finishing the Japanese history trilogy covering the imperial and contemporary eras of Japan. We will begin with the downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1860s and the modernization of the country under Emperor Meiji. We'll look into the turbulent 20th century with the takeover of the Japanese state by the military, World War II, and finish with the post-war history of Japan all the way up to today. Let's begin. Hey, Nancy.
Hi, Devon. How are you?
Doing great, especially now that you're here.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so tell me, what was the main thing that jumped out at you when you got to Japan for the first time? Like, what was just so different from America or Canada?
The politeness of everyone that we experienced. I mean, I think the very first person we asked a question, she didn't have an answer, and she sort of glided across the floor, and we were just, like, looking at each other like, where did she go? I mean, she wasn't running, but it was like the most interesting thing. And then we went out to to where our bus was picking us up to take us into Tokyo. And as the bus driver pulled up, all the staff bowed to the bus driver. It's like, oh, we are not in America anymore. The respect, the politeness, the just feeling so welcomed there was just literally from the moment we stepped off the plane was something that we had that I've traveled all around and I had never experienced it.
Yeah, is it almost like everyone just takes everything that they're doing really seriously? They just do the best that they can at everything?
They take everything seriously and they're so proud of their country. They want you to feel welcome and they're the whole society. It's a tipless society, which is incredible when you think about it. There's no tipping for cabs. Everyone does the job the way they're supposed to because they want to do it to that level of just blowing you away with their customer service, not with the expectation of I better give good service because I'm going to get a tip for it. Just completely different. I wasn't aware that it was a tipless society until I got there.
Yeah, I think Michelle also mentioned that. She just said that the amount of how polite and respectful everyone was just blew her away as soon as she got there.
Yeah, we were in hotels, like the room attendants they don't have carts because that's too messy. So they have runners that they come into your room and, you know, the main room attendant has a runner that takes the sheets and the towels and brings new ones that then she puts into the room. It's just every aspect of the society is about being polite. And I mean, it's like, I think my daughter mentioned, like you don't walk around with a beverage because you may spill it. Not just spill it on somebody else, but spill it on the ground. And so it just, everything comes across, it's very crowded, but it doesn't appear crowded because it's not dirty. It's so clean and, you know, it flows so well. I mean, it's just so well thought out.
And you're telling me like the people just kind of glide along the floor.
I cannot even begin to tell you. Probably both my husband and I were just like, how
is
does she
that?
do that? And my husband even mentioned that he works with a woman from Japan that she does the same thing. And it's just this, like, I don't know what it is. It's like a little shuffle, but it's done so gracefully. It's like they're gliding.
Like they're just like skating across like the
it's
floor
like
becomes an ice skating rink and they just glide across.
It's so amazing.
Yeah, it's fundamentally like a different society built from the ground up, like where everything is about doing it right and doing it with doing it authentically, I think, and being professional too.
Yeah, I mean, we were in the train system there is the most, I mean, if you want to talk about futuristic, the train system there is on levels of like a high-rise building with you have to go in and you have to find the levels, and there would be times people would just see us looking at the schedules and trying to figure out where we were, and they would say, come up and like, I speak a little English, can I help you? And divert their day and just go and show us where we needed to be. And it happened on multiple occasions where we just ran into people that were so kind and went out of their way to make sure that we found where we needed to be. If you ever look even a little bit puzzled, someone will come up and ask you if they can help you.
Yeah, so, but was it like cyberpunk or Blade Runner at all? Like, did it remind you of the aesthetic of those countries with like how futuristic it is? You know, there are all those neon signs and lights.
Yeah,
and
the
huge
neon
buildings.
signs. It kind of blew me away in that it is. I think of Japan as being this very kind of straight. I mean, this is my opinion, or at least prior to going to Japan, this very straight-laced society. And then when you're there, there's a lot of clubs, and there's areas for areas for the gentleman population. I mean, and they're very open about it. And that surprised the heck out of me. I mean, right on their main street in Tokyo, they have a shop called Condominium. I mean, you could have knocked us both over that, like on the street that there's like all these children's stores. It is Condominium at the end of the block on the street, right out there. That surprised me because I thought of the society as being a little bit more prudish than that. And they're much more open than we are about that.
Yeah, I think that's also just kind of going back to the foundations. Like Japan is not a Abrahamic society. They never adopted, well, of course, they didn't adopt Judaism, but they also never adopted Christianity or Islam.
Yeah, they're
so
really...
like the whole idea of like sin just doesn't really exist there. They don't see it that way.
They don't. The religion is a very interesting thing. I mean, they have like these core beliefs, but not like, oh, I made a sin, so now bless me, Father, I need forgiveness for it. Different than that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's also why, and it's not just Japan that's like this. If you go across like China, you can find lots of like gambling places that would be illegal if they were in America or I think probably anywhere in Europe. But because the whole culture doesn't really view it as a bad thing in itself, it's risky, but it's not really evil to gamble.
Yeah.
So you got stuff like Macau, which is actually bigger than Las Vegas now.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So that kind of just threw me, like I said, I had a vision of what I expected. And that was not having it kind of very out in the open was very surprising.
Yeah, I think
to
it's
me.
kind of something you have to experience firsthand just to be able to fully comprehend it. Yeah. So, what was the hardest thing to get used to in Japan? Because I'm assuming there are also things that were kind of strange to deal with.
No trash cans, and I know Michelle brought this up. But in 1995, there was the terrorist attack where they put the
sarin gas.
The sarin gas in the trash can, and 13 people were killed and thousands were injured. So trash cans became a thing that they pretty much, public trash cans got eliminated in a lot of places. And you own your trash. I mean, like you have to carry around a little trash bag, and then when you find trash cans, it's like, oh my gosh, I found a trash can. And they're not a trash can. There's like 4 or 5 trash cans, and you have to sort all your trash. At the end of a baseball game, you have a bag that you hook on the seat behind you has a little hook, and you put all your trash, and then you stand in line very patiently, leaving a baseball game, to sort your trash out. And I thought, and we laughed, looking at each other, going, "Can you imagine this in America? Not only do people just throw their stuff on the ground, you own your trash. I mean, you just make sure that there's not very many trash cans, and when you find one, you are expected to stand and wait patiently for your turn to use it and sort out everything."
Okay, now it gets controversial. How was World War II history presented in Japan?
What's very interesting about that, and we talked to some people that were involved, there's scholars that are involved in trying to change the interpretation of things. So you'd go into a museum and there would be descriptions in Japanese. There would be these long descriptions of stuff. And then in English, it would be like one sentence. And you're like, does that feel like you're missing out on a little bit of the story? Like, it's not translated word for word. And there are scholars that are trying to work with the museum system to make it so that the interpretation is standard. And it's an ongoing project. But it didn't even start until like within the last I think it's been like 15, 20 years at most. And it's been a long, slow process to make that kind of change. But there is definitely, it's slanted in a way.
Yeah, I think like even within back in 2017, there was a mayor who denied that there was this giant lynch mob that went down in Tokyo right after the earthquake. Vigilantes started coming out and just like murdering people. And I think one of the mayors actually said that she didn't think that happened, and it's still kind of acceptable today to say that.
They like to sanitize things because they don't like ugliness out there. I mean, it's very interesting. The society is built that a lot of, and I'm not saying this, I mean, just kind of a cultural thing, is that a lot of Asian people, a lot of Japanese people, their vision isn't as good. So it's a society that's built in like the crosswalks all have stuff for people that are vision impaired. However, the people that have mental illness, they're completely segregated. You will not see very few people in wheelchairs. Well, I mean, it's really interesting that that's kind of very closeted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a similar issue with crime, because it definitely happens. It just gets swept under the rug because no one wants to just openly say, yeah, Tokyo has a crime problem, or this area has like an issue with gangs. You know, they'd rather not admit to that. They'd rather just pretend it never happened.
Yes, what we were told. Like I said, you know, they like to sanitize it. They like to make it all pretty and polite, and you know, they don't want it to be off-putting. Oh, I mean, the other thing is that they have vending machines everywhere. And when I say everywhere, we were out rural. We went and visited family members we had foreign exchange students that stayed with us, and we went to Kashiwa, which is Torrance's sister city. And you're out in the boonies, and you're walking down just like a regular street, and there's flipping vending machines like in the middle of nowhere, and you're just like, they're like on every alleyway, and they serve hot and cold beverages in the same vending machine and sandwiches. It's just like this weird, like, wow, they have vending machines down to a pat. They also have a lot of vending machines where you go in and you order. They don't like touching cash. So you order what you want on a vending, like it's like a push button thing, and then you insert your money into it, and then give them the ticket of what you ordered, and that's really common in Japan.
Yeah,
and in Tokyo, there's I can't even tell you how many, but there's just like, you're walking down the street, and this is why Americans think it's very expensive, because they go to all the places that are catering to American tourists.
Yeah, but
So-
they're priced up because
they're priced up
tourists,
because
right?
of that, like the tourist traps. But if you walking around Tokyo, you see just a little stairway down, and there'll be like a little sign that in Japanese, it's like, this is a little restaurant. You go downstairs, and it's like maybe one chef, one waitress. It's a tiny, small little place, and they have completely competitive pricing. It's very affordable. But you have to know that I don't know that I would have ventured down a little stairway not knowing what the sign in Japanese said. And there's no there's no English to it. And that's all over Tokyo.
And finally, what do you think makes Japan unique more than anything else? Like, what is the one thing in Japan that makes it unique? Is it the politeness, do you think, or is it just the or is it just like the pride that everyone has in like their identity as like Japanese and like the Japanese nation, wanting to do everything the best that they can all the time? Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's something that was my sense there in my husband's, just the what makes it so unique is having a tip. I mean, we think about this. We tip now. I mean, there's a tip jar on everything. You go to fast food, you get somebody hands you something and it's like they want a tip for it. It's like we think of that like, oh, the only way I'm going to get good customer service is if I tip at this bar so the bartender will come back and give me a drink that has more than just ice and maybe a little bit. I mean, that's constantly in our brain that we're only going to get good service if we are tipping and being, the expectation that it's not only what you can expect, there's no tipping. The taxi drivers, they're wearing gloves and hats, and every single level of the society is just so polite and so proud of what they do. They don't need to be tipped for it. This is their job, and the tip comes from, they're paid a salary for doing their job. And the expectation or the actual, the requirement is that you give good service or you will not have that job.
Yeah, it's really simple to them.
Yeah, it's really simple. It's like, no, shouldn't be an expectation only if you tip that you're going to get service. That's the job that they're paid for, that they provide good service with whatever they're doing. So it's a completely different way than we're just taught to deal with anything in the customer service industry. And that I would love to see more of in America, because I feel like it's getting worse. I feel like nowadays, every single thing that you go to is got an iPad handing you, and how much do you want to tip? 18%, 22%, 25%, and it just keeps going up what the expectation for a tip is.
Yeah. And because I also thought one of the interesting things about Japan, at least from the outside, is that it fuses ancient traditions with modernity or even futuristic stuff in a way that most places really don't.
Oh, yeah.
Like in America, it's either you're going to a really traditional place that looks like it's still back in, like, say, the 1950s or maybe even before that, like the 1800s, or it's super modern, like New York City.
Right. You're walking around, and all of a sudden you see a temple, and just stuck in between like two big buildings, and so culturally, it's really this interesting mix. But I found that just, wonderful. You could walk outside your hotel that was in kind of in a very busy area, and then next door is this beautiful, restful temple and gardens, and such an interesting mix.
Yeah, I think it's the best mix. It would be very interesting if there was something like that here in America.
It would be, and I would, if for anyone, I would say go. It's a wonderful place to visit, and it will change your expectations of hospitality, and wish that we had more of it here in America.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nancy. This has been a
Thank
great
you,
interview.
Devon.
And I've now finally interviewed 3 different people on the World History Addicts podcast.
Woo! Yay! All right.
So, to recap the last episode with the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan was in a 2.5 century phase of isolation called Sakoku, where Japanese people could not leave the country, and they would be killed if they tried to re-enter, if someone knew that they left and then tried to come back in. And Westerners outside of the Dutch were also banned from entering Japan. But this changed in 1853 as U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with steamships and gunboats and demanded that Japan be opened up to diplomatic ties and trade. And he did this largely because Japan was an untapped market, and it would make for a great coaling station because it's close to both China and the Russian Far East. And this showed everyone that the shogunate was no longer powerful enough to defend Japan from outsiders. It couldn't maintain Japan's sovereignty, and several domains formed a coalition to overthrow the shogunate and restore the emperor to power. These domains were Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, and they armed themselves with modern European firearms and artillery, and they fought the Boshin War in 1868 all the way to 1869 to install the emperor against the shogunate. And they managed to win because the shogunate was a very rotted-out system, which was not all that well integrated, and it didn't have a modernized military, and its morale was very lacking because the samurai were just not being paid, so they were not the most loyal. Emperor Meiji then became the leader of the new Empire of Japan, making it the first time in 5 centuries that Japan was ruled by an emperor and not shoguns or samurai clans, as the last emperor to actually have any real power was Go-Daigo all the way back in 1339. So what did the Japanese Empire do under Emperor Meiji? Well, the Meiji was a modernizer, and because he understood and he accepted that Japan would need to follow the lead of the Western countries in order to survive, and that would mean adopting a Western-style government and reorganizing the military to Western standards, like adopting standardized weapons and guns and uniforms and a whole bureaucracy of officials to oversee the war efforts of any conflicts that Japan got into. And they would also have to adopt Western philosophies and technologies to a much greater extent than ever before. Before this, they actually did have some exposure to Western technologies. Like before, there was the Portuguese who brought in the muskets and arquebuses, and then the Dutch arrived, and there's this whole field of studies called Rangaku, which is about studying the technologies of Europe. But that was done in a very small scale, and it wasn't really pursued all that seriously because there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on Japan to change. So the Imperial Japanese Navy would be modeled on the British Royal Navy, while the Imperial Japanese Army would be modeled on the French Army, though later it would eventually be modeled on the Prussian and the Imperial German Army following the defeat of the French in the Franco-Prussian War back in 1871. And this is also around the same time that Japan begins its overseas empire, with the first major deployment of Japanese military forces being the Mudan incident also in 1871. There's a series of islands called the Ryukyu Islands to the south of Japan, and that includes Okinawa. And some of those sailors were sailing to the Qing dynasty, that's in China, but they were blown off course, landed in Taiwan, and a group of indigenous Aboriginal people in Taiwan killed, I think something like 60 of them, just as soon as they crashed. Not all of them were killed, but the Japanese saw this and decided that if the Qing dynasty in China couldn't defend its own subjects, Japan would do that. They didn't actually care that much about the subjects, but they just saw that as a great way to just wedge themselves in and attack both the tribes in Taiwan because they forced them to surrender in 1874. But they also gained control of the Ryukyu Islands by 1879 because they'd shown them that they were the only ones who could protect them, both from the Aborigines and from themselves. And then in 1877, you have the Satsuma Rebellion, which is ironically where the samurai who had overthrown the shogun in the first place were themselves crushed by the imperial government because they saw the last remaining independent samurai as a threat to the empire's power. And this is also the war where The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise takes place because it ends the era of the samurais and independent warrior nobility, and it begins the era of Japan as a modern industrial empire. So Japan continues to modernize. And eventually it's able to challenge China itself, which up until then had been the strongest country in the Far East, just by sheer volume and size. And arguably even it was the strongest country in the world until around the late modern era, starting in the late 1700s. And it's around this time after the beginning of the Meiji period that we start to see the rise of the Zaibatsu, or the vertically integrated business conglomerates or robber barons of Japan. They'd actually been around before the late 1800s, but it's only in this era that they start gaining real power. And some of them are actually still very powerful and around today. Like the big four are Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Yasuda. One other overlooked development that doesn't get brought up a whole lot in this period of Japan is the formation of the Kempeitai, or the Corps of Law Soldiers. They're a military police organization that oversees internal security as well as control over the colonies and monitoring the Japanese military itself for any potential subversive or disloyal activities. And I find them to be especially unique because other of these secret police agencies and authoritarian regimes like the Nazis or in the Soviet Union really only started after World War I or even after World War II, because the KGB didn't even exist until the 1950s. But the Kempeitai were around as early as 1881, and they lasted all the way to 1945. Then in 1894, the Japanese began expanding into Korea after there was the Donghak Peasants' Rebellion, which was an anti-Western and neo-Confucian uprising against internal reforms, because Korea was still independent and they were trying to reform, but many peasants weren't on board with that, so they rebelled. And the Qing dynasty sent in Chinese soldiers into Korea, and that sparked a conflict with Japan because they wanted control over Korea. And it lasted up until 1895. And Japan actually won, despite most of the foreign observers predicting that Japan would lose, because, of course, China is so much larger, and they had been the establishment power in Asia for thousands of years. And besides, China had also purchased a bunch of these warships called the Beiyang Fleet from European nations. But the problem, I think, is that they weren't very good at using those ships. They weren't the ones who had made those ships themselves. Logistics and maintenance just wasn't quite there. But Japan was able to maintain and manage all of their ships. So the Imperial Japanese Navy was able to crush China's Beiyang Fleet. And this is also where Japan captures Taiwan, and why Taiwan became a Japanese colony up until the end of World War II. And it's also why my grandfather, whose family lived in Taiwan since the 1600s, really didn't like the Japanese at all. And that includes all the Japanese on my mom's side of the family, too. And the IJA, or Imperial Japanese Army, also intervened in 1900, along with the armies of Britain, France, Germany, America, Russia, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, against the Boxer rebels, or the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which I guess, like the Donghak movement, was a reactionary movement aimed at stopping Western influence, or just in the Chinese case, foreigners, because they didn't like the Japanese operating in China either. And they showed up in response to foreign governments like Japan or especially England, setting up quasi-colonies on Chinese soil and then making demands from the government. And it was encouraged by the then Chinese empress, and she allowed Japan to get a concession of Tianjin, a city in northern China, which was shared between all of the 8 nations that intervened in the rebellion and eventually won alongside Belgium for some reason. But Japan's most famous war in the Meiji era was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. And the reason is because all of these previous wars, like the ones against the native people in Taiwan, or the ones against the samurai, or against China, were all internal Asian on Asian wars. But this was different because Russia was a European power. And at the time, it was also, well, I guess maybe like today, it was also a pariah state because it had a very illiberal and draconian kind of rule over its own population, even by the standards of 1904. And there's also this increasing pattern of really violent massacres of Russian Jews, like the Kishinev massacre in 1903, where a bunch of guys with weapons and clubs and knives just started massacring people in what's now Moldova for 3 whole days. And the Russian army really took its time in stopping the violence, which made people question just how competent the Russian army actually was. But more relevant to Japan, the Russians were very aggressive in the Far East against Korea, which kind of like what China had done about a decade before. That led to Japan launching a preemptive strike against the Russian Navy in Port Arthur, which is their Pacific fleet. And they defeated the Russian Baltic fleet because that's the fleet on Russia's European coast, because they had to sail through the North Sea. They had to go into the South Atlantic. They had to go around Africa. And then they had to go through the Indian Ocean just to reach Japan. And as soon as they got there, they were just destroyed. Now, on land, Japan had more difficulty stopping the Russians because, as you could imagine, the Russians just heavily outnumbered them. But logistics problems plus very poor meritocracy and training in the Russian officer class led to them losing the war anyway. So Korea becomes a protectorate of Japan. because they hadn't been able to defend themselves from the Russians or the Japanese, and Japan wanted to extend their power into the Asian mainland. And then after this, the Japanese government annexed Korea in 1910, which also wouldn't change until the end of World War II. But then 2 years later, Emperor Meiji died, and he was succeeded by Emperor Taisho, who was very unhealthy and not very involved in politics, which allowed more political players like Japan's parliament and other civilian organizations have more and more power making decisions. And then 2 more years after that, the Great War starts in 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which I covered in the Hungary episode. But one lesser-known fact is that Japan was also involved in World War I, because Germany and Austria-Hungary had small holdings in China and the Pacific, like Tianjin and the Caroline Islands, which they had built up over the 19th century. And Japan took the opportunity, while these 2 countries were distracted fighting a total war in Europe, to seize them because they were also part of the Allies. The First World War also was followed directly by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and then the very bloody civil war between the Russian communists and a loose coalition of anti-communist forces known as the White Army, though there were, I think at one point, there were like 3 different White Armies, and sometimes they even fought each other, but the only thing they could agree on was that the Reds were bad and that they wanted to get rid of them. So Japan sent forces to back up the White Armies alongside quite a few other Western countries like the British, the French, the U.S., even the Czechoslovaks, believe it or not, because they sent troops to fight for the Russian army against the Austro-Hungarians. The Russians were part of the Allies. The Austro-Hungarians were part of the Central Powers, and they ruled over Czechoslovakia. But they found themselves trapped in hostile territory because the Russian Empire was overthrown, and then the Bolsheviks took over. And the interventions were not all that effective because the revolutionaries had control over the railroads, and there were just too many competing objectives within the Allies. But Japan did keep occupying Siberia until 1922 when they were forced out. The year after that, in 1923, there was a gigantic, massive magnitude 8 earthquake in the Kanto region, which is actually not a real region of Japan and not the location of Generation 1 in Pokemon. And it also killed over 100,000 people. And also there were massive race riots because the ethnic Japanese started to view all these minority groups like the Koreans or the Taiwanese who had been brought in as laborers, or just left-wing Japanese like anarchists, as potentially being in a position to take advantage of the chaos and just and make things worse. So they just started murdering them. And 3 years after that, Emperor Taisho died in 1926, and the Taisho era ended, which was replaced by the Showa era under Emperor Hirohito. And in 1929, there was the stock market crash, and that brought the Great Depression to Japan. So why did the Japanese military take over the government? There have been many theories as to why it happened, but there was an undercurrent of militarism and really extreme kind of political ideologies forming underground, especially following World War I and leading up to the Great Depression, because there were militarists who believed Japan needed to become a military superpower to compete with the Western powers after what they saw in the fields of, like, say, France or Germany during that war. There were Pan-Asianists who wanted to make Japan the leading nation in Asia to expel the Europeans and Americans. There were Buddhist fundamentalists who wanted to eradicate Christianity and Christian-derived belief systems in any land that was majority Buddhist. And there are also ultranationalists and racial supremacists who wanted to prove the Japanese were the superior race above both other Asians and the whites. So they didn't have that much in common, but they all hated the liberal civilian government. And as discontent grew with Japan's request at racial equality being turned down in the 1920s, there was a big League of Nations conference, and Japan just requested that all the nations in the League, not even all people or all minority groups, but just all the countries that had proven themselves, could get racial equality and be treated the same. But apparently that was too much for the white countries, so they turned that down, and Japan was very bitter after that. And in 1931, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria after a false flag attack conducted by rogue Japanese officers, and they installed a puppet regime called Manchukuo, which was actually run by the former emperor of China known as Puyi. The central government didn't sanction any of this, but the power of the military and politics was growing, and it set the precedent that insubordination in the name of patriotism was actually a good thing, and that Japanese officers going rogue and launching unauthorized wars against foreign countries was actually something to be praised. There's also a wave of assassinations in the early 1930s from the League of Blood incident in 1932, where a group of ultranationalists assassinated the former finance minister Inoue Junosuke and businessman Dan Takuma. And that same year, on May 15th, a group of fanatic military officers murdered the Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai, and they weren't punished very harshly either. They actually used the publicity from the trial to promote ultranationalism, kind of in a similar way that Hitler promoted his own platform of German nationalism after he got arrested during the beer hall putsch in 1923. And then in 1936, there was the February 26th incident, which saw 1,400 military officers launch a coup on Tokyo, but it failed, and it also led to the Japanese military taking over Japan. And during this time, there were two main factions among these extremists. There was the Kodaha, or the Imperial Way, and they were much more esoteric and spiritual ultranationalists. They wanted to overthrow the whole government and create a Showa restoration and imperial absolutist state. But there's also the Toseiha, or the control faction, and they were much more pragmatic. And they realized that Japan was now a modern state and returning it to the ways of the samurai, but with modern battleships and planes, just wasn't going to work. And they wanted to use Japan's institutions and business interests instead. So the two clashed up until 1936 with the February 26th incident, where the Toseiha faction won out and they ended the rule of the civilian government by 1937, which is also the year that the invasion of China proper began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident. They staged another false flag attack, and then they started the Second Sino-Japanese War, or which is the Chinese theater of World War II. And now we're at World War II. So what did Japan do during World War II? Well, 1937 was a very bloody year because the Japanese military invaded southward from Manchuria, and they carried out some of the most violent atrocities in modern history, from the rape of Nanking, where they killed 300,000 people who were burned alive, beheaded, or stabbed to death by the Japanese soldiers, along with more bloodshed and slaughter in the Battle of Shanghai. Japan's empire was arguably the most extreme and sadistic out of all the armies in World War II, like even more cruel and even more inhumane than the Nazis, even if they weren't going for industrial genocide for the sake of genocide. Because Unit 731 was arguably the most extensive and deadly human experimentation organization in history. And it carried out mass crimes against humanity, like infecting people with the Black Plague and freezing people in water to experiment on what frostbite would look like. They got grenades and bombs and tied people up and just tested bombs on them. Many people were dissected alive, including like people's heads being cut open with axes so they could remove their brains. They attached people's throats and intestines together to see what would happen. And outside of the labs, like even when there wasn't any of this research going on, Japanese soldiers would routinely dismember and murder civilians and surrender POWs who had already given up all their weapons. And it got to the point that Nazi diplomats stationed in China actually went out of their way to stop ongoing rapes that were being carried out in broad daylight. Now, the wars in Asia began before the wars in Europe, starting with the German invasion of Poland in 1939. So it's often kind of debated whether the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War counts as the start of World War II itself. And for the purpose of this episode, I'm going to say that it does, because Europe was involved to some degree because there were military advisors stationed out inside of China, including the Nazi diplomats who were appalled by what was going on. But it's also because the invasion of China is effectively the same conflict that Japan waged against the other nations of the Pacific and the Far East. And if we were only to count the time that Japan was at war with the other nations, like the British or the French or the Dutch, well then only 1941 to 45 would count, because it was only in 1941 that the Japanese military launched attacks on Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, and Malaya, which brought into conflict with the U.S. and the British Empire. Another point is that the Soviet Union was basically a rogue state prior to 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, because it was invading Finland and the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and it even invaded Poland at the same time as Nazi Germany from the east, which was part of a scheme with Hitler to take over Europe. And on a more obscure note, the Soviets and Japanese also fought each other in 1939 before the USSR had actually joined the Allies. They fought in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol on the Mongolian border, which is to the west of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. And this battle showed that while Japan could crush unindustrialized enemies like the Chinese or the Koreans, or they could dominate the seas with its modern navy, like even pushing back the British, it wasn't very effective on land against a dedicated industrial land power like the Soviets, who had very good cavalry and tanks. What I also found is that Japan was never formally at war with Free France because in 1940, Germany invaded France and took over, but then the French government split in two because there was the Free French side led by Charles de Gaulle. They wanted to keep fighting for French freedom and liberation. But then you had the Vichy France faction led by the World War I war hero and General Philippe Pétain. And he allied himself with the Axis, and French Indochina and much of France's overseas empire actually sided with Vichy France, as in with the collaborators who were helping Nazi Germany take over France. And this meant that when Japan did attack French Indochina, which includes modern-day Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam in 1940, they were actually attacking a fellow Axis nation in Vichy France, not Free France. But this was also the beginning of the end for Japan, as while they had made great gains in China by this point, they had effectively declared war against the largest nation in the world and the country with the most potential in the world, the British and the Americans. And they had an unimaginable amount of colonial resources and naval power, so they had bitten off way more than they could chew by attacking both of them. So in 1942, the Japanese Empire was at its peak. They had launched invasions they were controlling or occupying China, all of Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Southeast Asia going into British Bengal, and across the Polynesia to the Aleutian Islands. So it's a very unusual kind of empire. It's an island ruling a continent-sized mainland directly next to it with vastly larger land holdings. The only analog I could find to this in terms of what it looks like on a map was the Srivijaya or Majapahit Empire based in Palembang or Java in Indonesia or Malaysia. But Japan's empire was vastly larger and much more brutal. So it's also in this year that Japan invades the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia, which is along with expanding the war to British Burma, starting the Bengal famine, which killed millions more people. The IGN, or Japanese Navy, raided all the way into the Indian Ocean at British Ceylon or modern-day Sri Lanka, and that's the high water mark of Japan's naval reach. The Japanese also wanted to invade Australia and New Zealand, but the Americans knew about this and they stopped them at Guadalcanal, and they began using island hopping tactics of capturing strategic islands in order to incrementally wear down Japan's position in the Pacific. Though America did actually, at the very beginning, skip all that and just go to straight retaliation for Pearl Harbor by bombing Tokyo during the Doolittle raid. But it didn't do a whole lot of damage. There weren't that many planes they could get over. The raiders were captured in China, and because the Soviets didn't allow them to land on their territory, the Japanese executed them after they had been caught, and they also massacred hundreds of thousands of civilians who had been accused of helping the Doolittle raiders. And then in 1942, you have the Battle of Midway. It takes place in Midway Atoll to the northwest of Hawaii. It ends in several of Japan's best aircraft carriers being sunk, and from this point on, Japan is going to struggle to replace ships in the Navy, as the U.S. Navy only gets stronger as they start ramping up production on the mainland. In 1943, the Americans liberate the Aleutian Islands from Japanese occupation, and they make it. This is the most recent time a U.S. territory inside North America has been occupied by a foreign enemy nation. And they also freed New Guinea from Japanese occupation, and that opened a path to the Philippines, which had been under Japanese control since the previous year. By 1944, Japan was clearly losing the war as they had attempted to invade from British Burma into British Bengal, but they were pushed back by the British colonial troops. And then there was also the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the U.S. Navy stopped hundreds of Japanese planes and shot them down. And it's also the largest battle between aircraft carriers in all of history. But a few months after that, there was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is actually the largest naval battle in history, period. And it's also where the liberation of the Philippines started to begin. Japan tried to fight its way out of this by doing some mass mobilization in Operation Ichigo in China. They launched a surge of soldiers to capture a bunch of major cities, but there wasn't a whole lot of gains to that. And the year after 1945, Japan was struggling to defend any part of its empire, including in China, because the Chinese forces won in the city of Changde. And it's also in this year that the entire war effort falls apart because U.S. forces, along with the British, retook mainland Southeast Asia, and they also took over Iwo Jima and Okinawa, so it was now possible to bomb Japanese cities directly. And these gains were followed by the Tokyo firebombing, which was actually deadlier than the following atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed around 150,000 people. But Japan didn't surrender until after the invasion of Manchukuo by the Soviet Union, which they blitzed through it very easily and even started to get into North Korea. The causes of why Japan surrendered and if the atomic bombings were necessary are also highly controversial and still debated. But I do think that The war against Japan was very different from the one against Germany because the emperor had to be made to surrender in order to get Japan's overseas generals and admirals and other troops to surrender too. If they hadn't done that, like let's say Japan had been invaded, like the mainland had been invaded, there would probably still be armies in China and in Indonesia and maybe in other holdouts in Southeast Asia who would keep fighting. And after the devastating bombings, like both the firebombs and the nuclear bombs, the emperor realized that if he didn't surrender, Japan would lose even more, and there would be nothing he could do about it. So, and also, even after World War II ended, there were cases of holdout soldiers in Southeast Asia and the Pacific who didn't believe Japan had lost the war, and they continued to attack anyone in that area up until the 1970s when two men named Hiro Onoda in the Philippines and another man named Teruo Nakamura in Indonesia were finally convinced that the war was over, and they actually were convinced to surrender. So what happened after World War II? Well, the end of the Pacific War also ended World War II, which was a great relief for all the people around the world, including Japan, because the war had made life incredibly miserable for common people, especially after famine began to set in and kill even more people than the bombings. There were many war criminals who had to be dealt with, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had been behind much of the war, including the drive to attack the U.S. and British. He was hung in 1948, though other horrific figures like the Unit 73 commander Shiro Ishii, who had overseen thousands of people being dissected and infected with plagues, was given immunity by the U.S. government because he had lots of valuable research, which no one, including the Nazis, had been willing to obtain just due to how terrible the experiments were. Another major twist was that, unlike in Germany, Japan did not have a cohesive ideology like Nazism, and there wasn't a central Hitler figure or Mussolini figure, not even the emperor, who was actually spared and remained in power until he died in 1989. The Japanese military had taken over the government in a decentralized kind of way, and unfortunately, it would have been impossible to denazify the Japanese government in the same way that had been done in Germany, because there were just so many former high-ranking war criminals who just remained in power. And this is a major difference between Japan and Germany, because Germany has apologized many, many times for starting World War II and the Holocaust, but Japan has very often tried to downplay or even deny well-documented atrocities like the comfort women, that they were military sex slaves for the occupied territories, or the rape of Nanking, which is often heavily downplayed or denied. The 1950s and 60s saw Japan's reconstruction and an economic miracle which mirrored the one seen in Europe or the U.S. after the war also took place. It isn't very often that the losers of war prosper more than they would have if they had never started the war in the first place. And after World War II, Japan signed into law a renunciation of military aggression, which is kind of ironic because it was actually the U.S. who wanted this to change, because having an allied militarized Japan in the region would be great for them. But this didn't happen, and it wasn't until the Iraq War in 2003 that Japan sent its own soldiers out to fight a foreign enemy. So, where's Japan today? Since around the 1950s, Japan has been first and foremost known for soft power through culture and consumer goods. There have been cars that have been exported pretty widely, like Toyota and Honda, and there have been electronics for like computers and music players. And in the 1980s, there were lots and lots of video games. Nintendo was actually, believe it or not, founded in the 1800s as a card game company. But in the 1980s, it became famous for titles like The Legend of Zelda, Mario, and Donkey Kong. Though in that decade, there were major worries that while Japan was on the side of the U.S. and NATO, it was still an economic threat. It was a rapidly rising power that was blindsiding the U.S. while it was focused on containing the Soviets. And it's for this reason you start to see the emergence of the cyberpunk genre. It's a specific kind of capitalist dystopia with an Eastern flair, because the men running it aren't European or American, they're Japanese or from some other part of the Far East. And it's also around this time that you start to see anime enter the West, with titles like Dragon Ball Z kind of being a gateway for Western audiences into a medium like anime that really, up until then, hadn't been for outsiders. It had been created by Japanese artists for a Japanese fan base. And then in the 1990s, there was a gigantic economic crash because Japan was doing well, but it had overinflated how well it was doing. And investors were pouring money into a degree that was unreasonable even then. And like every bubble, it popped. And Japan today hasn't even fully recovered from it. I forget who said this, but the quote says that Japan has been living in the year 2000 since 1980. And by this point, Japan is well established as a great power, even if it's not militarily, and it's the second most powerful economy in the world. But that changes when China begins to reassert itself as the grandmaster of the East and overtakes Japan to become the second largest economy in 2010, which leaves Japan at the low spot of third place instead. So, and in the present, Japan's economy has actually started to lag because it has a very low birth rate in an aging population. And one of the great issues of Japan in Japan today is immigration, because Europe took in many migrants, mostly from third world countries in Africa or the Middle East, and this led to many social problems from Islamic fundamentalists thriving among immigrants and recruiting immigrants who weren't able to integrate into society and who were much more worse off economically than their European neighbors, and were very bitter about that. And there's also a spike in violent crime because, well, crime levels of this magnitude aren't all that unusual in, say, like Nigeria or Iraq. They are very unusual in Western European countries or in Japan, and Japan knows this. And recently, a woman named Sanae Takaichi, who's the first woman ever to become the prime minister of Japan, won the election, and she vowed to stop immigration to the country. And we can only watch and see what happens next. So what can we conclude from the modern history of Japan? Japan's late 19th, 20th century, and 21st century history tells us a few things about the broader pattern of how the world works. First, that there's often major exceptions to generally accepted rules. Like Japan was assumed to be another Asiatic country like China or Korea, which were not capable of modernizing because they weren't European. But that turned out to be completely wrong, and it also created some major issues for race thinkers back in the day because they had to come up with some very strange explanations for why Japan was able to beat Russia. Like the Japanese were actually secretly Aryans who had been mixed, or they were really Indo-Europeans who just kind of looked Asian due to long-term adaptation. They weren't really Asian in the first place. They were really white in all but appearance. The second point, I think, is that progress can often be misused because Japan's progress was very impressive, but it also led to some of the worst atrocities in modern history. It's Asia's version of the Holocaust. And it reminded the whole world that unchecked power and ambition is a menace wherever it appears, in Europe or anywhere else. And tying into that, in hindsight, it was kind of silly to assume Japan wouldn't be able to modernize just because it wasn't a white country. But it's also silly to overlook how exceptional Japan is as a culture, given that the same land that gave us the Unit 73-1 and the Rape of Nanking are also the creators of Hello Kitty and Super Mario Bros. Because dedication, focus, and imagination are really tools, and they can be used for destruction or for construction. They're not mutually exclusive. And finally, it's important to remember that no society is perfect. People often point to Japan as a society where there's no crime and it's not bogged down by Western problems like Christian fundamentalism or black slavery or drug use or like mass shootings, but it's still fundamentally a society with major demographic issues, and it hasn't really come to terms with much of its recent history. And I think the election of Sanae Takaichi is an attempt to further obscure these problems, and I don't know how successful that's going to be. Thank you so much for joining us in the finale of the History of Japan. I hope you enjoyed listening to over an hour and a half of combined content, and there will be more videos and series of this length on the podcast in the future. You can follow us on Instagram at World History Addicts Podcast, and follow my friend Doan and his podcast at Entertainment Fanatics Pod. Hopefully we can see you again soon. Mata ne!